China established over 20 years ago a rather remarkable body which it calls the China Council on International Cooperation, Environment and Development. It is constituted of about 25 leading experts, practitioners of the sustainable development, environment development arena, from science, from ministries, from the private sector. And on the other side is a group of 25 leaders from across China, ministries, the Chinese Academy of Sciences, some entrepreneurs, and once a year this body meets for 3 days, commissions reports on anything from ecological tax reform to emissions to sometimes very specific issues such as ecosystem management or the logging ban, indeed, that China put in place after the massive floods and disasters of the 1980s and 1990s was in part a consequence also of looking at international experience of how forest ecosystems were at least one key part of the solution. These study groups then continue throughout the year with Chinese and international experts to produce what are cutting-edge reports that have access to all the data within China and produce the policy recommendations that we then once a year present to the Premier of China in a setting of a discussion that lasts about an hour. Without notes, face-to-face, and I think the fact that China has continued with this consultative body is a signal that here is a country that is looking for the best of expertise it can gather from around the world and then develop its own approach and answers to some of these big challenges. And I think for anybody who has served on this body, first of all, the insight you get, not only statistically, empirically, but also the thought process, the policy process in China, is a fascinating outlook to become an optimist about the future trajectory or the future pathway of this country when it comes to some of these issues. But also, I think, a very stark look at the challenge, the nature and the scope and the scale of the challenge today. You know, trying to capture the complexity of China in the year 2013 or over the last 20 years, or even projected as many do into the next 20 years, is a very complex, let's say, exercise. I think we can observe many things in China today, and I think much of what is today sort of common knowledge or common sense in the world's media and the perception of China is more judgment than observation. There is no question that China is today one of the countries on the planet with the greatest challenges in environmental, let's say, legacies that it has to carry as it has moved forward through this rapid development, rapid industrialization, rapid urbanization, the introduction of mobility, transport. So I think if you go to China today, from the leadership to the public citizen in the street, there is an immense sense of an urgency to address this legacy, be it in pollution terms, erosion of ecosystems. Where the world, I think, sometimes is, in a sense, not given an adequate view of what is actually happening in China is the pace at which China is actually addressing this legacy. Without any mathematical basis, I would say that China is probably 3 to 4 times faster than virtually any country I have observed in terms of cleaning up after a massive development jump its legacy of the past. It is an enormous legacy. It is killing hundreds of thousands of people. Air pollution is a drama. But the measures that China has taken in just 10 years took Europe 25 years in terms of, for example, emission standards from vehicles. In the midst of the financial crisis, it was China that had, in absolute number terms, in euros spent, the largest fiscal stimulus package that you could call a green fiscal stimulus package. Emission standards are being introduced. China, for the last 15 to 20 years, is already a net foresting country. Much of the Asian net balance of forestry is actually attributable to China's massive afforestation efforts, combined with a forest logging ban 15 years ago. Now, the consequence of that is that China's demand found its way onto the global markets, and herein lies the dilemma. It's not only a matter of stopping pollution, it's also a question of how 1.3 billion people in the world supply themselves with energy, with food, with building materials, with technology. And that, I think, is the challenge of China's, in a sense, transition towards an ecological civilization. And again, many in the global domain do not necessarily believe in these discussions, but I think China's both tradition and history, but also the contemporary discussion about development, has on the one hand a root in Chinese and Confucian traditions, but also it is a science-based approach. In China, I sometimes have far less problems talking about the nature of the problem and the scale of it than I encounter in other countries. because people do know the numbers, they do know the challenge. Are the forces of global demand and the yearning by Chinese to escape the poverty trap going to continue to create a great deal of pressure? Absolutely. It's the same debates we have in any country across the planet when you have to look at employment, at opportunities, economic growth, energy security. But what I think from a vantage point of the United Nations system, but also particularly the United Nations Environment Programme, is fascinating is that the notion of a transition towards a green economy is already part of the DNA of the development trajectory that this country is pursuing. Now the question becomes one, how quickly, how systematically, and how, in terms of its vastness of population and territory, can it make this happen?